Hello all, my name is Ashutosh Rastogi. I am a teacher by profession. My mission is to impart quality education for all. For that purpose I am creating these videos. If you appreciate my work, then please do like my video and subscribe my channel so that I could get the motivation to prepare more videos.
Anyways, today in this particular lecture, we will going to discuss about modulation index in the amplitude modulation systems, which is also being called as your depth of modulation or degree of modulation. So these are the outlines. We're going to start up with the introduction. Then we will going to define modulation index, and depending upon the value of modulation index, how we can classify them, just as your perfect modulation, under modulation and over modulation. We're going to take a look on that. And then finally we're going to discuss some of the numerical problems related to the modulation index. So in our last lecture, we have discussed about the amplitude modulation and its bandwidth requirement. We have also evaluated the generalized expression of your amplitude modulated systems. So continuing to our discussion, in this particular lecture, we are going to talk about the modulation index, which is an important parameter in your AM systems. So what is it? So the modulation index is being defined as the measure of extent of amplitude variation about an unmodulated maximum carrier. So if you closely observe the basic definition of amplitude modulation systems, what we have studied is the instantaneous amplitude of my carrier signal will get varied as per the instantaneous amplitude of my message signal. What I wanted to tell you at this particular point about the modulation index is, if you talk about the amplitude modulated signal, then that signal can be given like this one. This is our time axis T, and this is our carrier amplitude AC, and this is its amplitude variation, that is your AC plus AM. So our envelope will be going to look like this one. This is basically our envelope. If we closely observe that, this is our carrier signal, and the amplitude variation, or you could say the depth of modulation, will going to take around at this particular line, this AC. So if we closely observe that, the amplitude variation will going to look around this particular line AC, that is from this particular point it is increasing and it is decreasing. So the complete variation of amplitude modulated waveform will going to turn around at the unmodulated maximum carrier frequency only. This is what I wanted to tell you about the modulation index. It is also being represented by MA, and in some books it has been represented with mu. So mathematically the modulation index can be given as MA will be equal to mod of MT, which is nothing but your message signal. So the maximum amplitude of our message signal divided by the maximum carrier amplitude or the maximum amplitude of your carrier signal. So it is also called as the depth of modulation, degree of modulation, or modulation factor. So why it is being called as depth of modulation, I had already explained. So other two names of this modulation index are your degree of modulation or modulation factor. So the maximum amplitude of the message signal must be less than or equal to the maximum amplitude of the carrier signal in order to avoid any sort of distortion in the modulated signal. So what kind of distortions I'm talking about at this particular moment, when we're going to discuss about your over modulation case, you guys get to know about the distortions, what type of distortions I'm talking about. The minimum value of the modulation index will be 0. So I mean, what is the physical significance of the value of modulation index will be 0, since it is the ratio of maximum amplitude of your message signal divided by the maximum amplitude of your carrier signal. So only the case the minimum value of modulation index will be equal to 0 is that when the message signal amplitude is 0, that is there will be no message signal, or you could say that there will be no modulation. So the minimum value of modulation index will be 0 only in the case when in our modulated signal only carrier signal is present, or you could say your message signal is absent. This is the physical significance of the value of modulation index will be equal to 0. So based on the value of modulation index, there are three types of modulation. So basically we can classify or we can characterize the value of modulation index, whether its value will be equal to 1, it is less than 1, and it is greater than 1. So depending upon these criteria, we can classify our modulation index in 3 types, that is your perfect modulation case, under modulation case, and over modulation case. So the perfect modulation has a modulation depth of 100%. That is, in this particular case, the since the modulation depth is equal to 100%, it means the maximum amplitude of your message signal will be equal to the maximum amplitude of your carrier signal. So in this particular case, the carrier falls off to 0. So this particular figure is basically showing that at this particular instant, at this particular point, your carrier level falls out to be 0. Perfect modulation causes no distortion. So if this will be the case, no distortion will going to take place. What type of distortions, or what do we mean by distortion is, if in the presence of distortion we are not in a state to get our message signal or information signal back. So distortions will basically going to provide us a lossy transmission, or some of the information part will get lost, or we are nowhere to find out that lossy portion of the signal, and we are in the loss of the information part. So in this particular case, in the case of perfect modulation, your value of MA will be equal to 1, since we had already defined as MA is equal to maximum amplitude of your message signal divided by the maximum amplitude of carrier signal, and if both the values are same, so in that particular case the ratio turns out to be 1, and when we are going to evaluate that value in terms of percentage, that turns out to be 100%. So this figure is basically showing the perfect modulation or 100% modulation. Second is your under modulation. So in the under modulation case, it has the modulation depth less than 100. So basically depth we are talking about here, we will be having this unmodulated carrier line, and round about this unmodulated carrier line we will be having the amplitude variation. Whenever we are talking about depth of modulation, we are always concerned about this unmodulated carrier frequencies maximum amplitude line. The amplitude variation depth will get measured from this particular line only. So in this under modulation case, the carrier level falls above 0. That means since the amplitude of your carrier signal is greater than the amplitude of your message signal, obviously the maximum amplitude of your message signal, so it means that particular line will never going to cross this 0 value, since your carrier amplitude is greater than the peak amplitude of your message signal. So this will never going to pass through this or falls below this 0 line. So under modulation case, no distortion will going to take place, since it is not at all passing through this 0 crossing line. So there will be no ambiguity to find out the instantaneous value of the message signal. We are always in a state to find out the message signal and at each and every point instant of time. So in this particular case, no loss will going to take place, or we could say that distortionless transmission is possible. So this particular figure is basically showing the under modulation case. So here from this particular envelope, we are in a state to find out the actual message signal back properly without having any distortion or any loss. Now the third one is your over modulation case. It has the modulation depth of greater than 100%. It means in this particular case, the maximum amplitude of your message signal AM is greater than the maximum amplitude of your AC. So when we are going to evaluate the ratio, that is your AM upon AC, that will be greater than 1, since AM is greater than AC. So in this over modulation case, the carrier wave experiences a 180-degree phase reversal where the carrier level falls below the 0 point. So at this particular point we are talking about, since our signal will going to vary from this particular point to this peak, and it is going down. So at this particular point, when we'll trying to recover that original message signal back, so instead of getting this much amount of signal with the help of envelope detector, we are basically getting this value of the signal, so which is not as same as the actual message signal. So due to these distortions, we are not in a state to capture the actual message signal, and this signal will get lost. That is why we are saying that there exists a distortion in this particular case. One more important point is here we will also going to have this phase reversal of the carrier signal. If you closely observe that here at this particular point, our carrier signal is not continuous, it is having a phase reversal of 180 degree from the previous one. That is why over modulation systems are not being used so far, just because our message signal will not get preserved in this particular case, and we'll going to have this lossy transmission. So over modulation causes severe distortion of the waveform of the message signal, which results in the data loss. This about this point I'm talking about. So here in this particular case, we'll going to have this lossy data transmission. So over modulation is one of the reasons why amplitude modulation is no longer used to transmit the high quality sound signal. So in high quality sound signals, no signal loss would have been tolerated, but since it is a lossy transmission, so that is why it has not been used for transmitting the high quality sound signals. At the transmitter limiter are include which prevent more than 100% modulation. So in order to avoid this over modulation case at the transmitter, we are also using certain amplitude limiters which will going to help us to prevent this over modulation case. So now this particular figure we have to calculate the modulation index. So one more important point to calculate about the modulation index, that will be equal to Vmax minus Vmin over Vmax plus Vmin, where Vmax and Vmin can be given by this particular thing. So this is a typical envelope that is shown in this particular figure. The peak value, that is basically your maximum amplitude of your message signal plus maximum amplitude of your carrier signal, that would have been represented as your Vmax. So you could also say that Vmax will be equal to your AC plus AM, and if you closely observe about this Vmin, this is nothing but your Vc minus Vm. So Vmin can be evaluated as your AC minus AM, where this AC is denoting the peak amplitude of your carrier signal, or AM is denoting the peak amplitude or maximum amplitude of your message signal. So modulation index can also be evaluated as Vmax minus Vmin over Vmax plus Vmin. So we can simply take the smaller derivation about this, how the MA will be equal to this, since from the definition modulation index MA is equal to AM upon AC by definition. So if we just put the value of this Vmax and Vmin in this particular equation from this, then we can find out Vmax can be given as AC plus AM minus Vmin is given as your AC minus AM upon, again Vmax will be equal to AC plus AM plus Vmin will be equal to AC minus AM. This plus AM minus AM get cancel out, and this AC and this AC also get cancel out, and we are left with 2 times of AM upon 2 times of AC, which is nothing but your AM upon AC, which is nothing but your MA or mu. So this is the simplest derivation to find out the value of modulation index. If figure based question is there and you have to find out the modulation index, you can easily find out via this particular formula. MA is equal to Vmax minus Vmin over Vmax plus Vmin, which is nothing but it is equivalent to your AM upon EC. So in this particular given numerical, we need to find out the modulation index of the waveform of the AM signal given below. So that particular signal will going to start it out from this 30. It means we can say that the carrier signal, that is nothing but your AC given to us, that will be equal to your 30. Vmax from the figure, this value is your Vmax, and that Vmax will be equal to your 50. And if we have to evaluate this, V min that we need to calculate it out, and obviously we do not have any knowledge about our AM, what is the value of AM. So by observing this particular figure, we could easily observe that AC is 30, Vmax is equal to AC plus AM. So we could evaluate this AM as your Vmax, that is 50 minus 30. So it implies your AM will be equal to 20. So now by a simple definition, we could evaluate the value of modulation index. MA will be equal to AM upon AC, that turns out to be 20 upon 30, that will be equal to 2 by 3 or 0.667. So suppose if the value of V minimum is also known to us, so how we will going to evaluate that value of MA? So again, applying the same formula, your MA will be equal to Vmax minus Vmin upon Vmax plus Vmin. So from this particular figure, this point is nothing but your Vmin, and how we will going to calculate this Vmin? Vmin will be nothing but your 30 minus your AM turns out to be nothing but your 20, that turns out to be 10. So while simply applying this particular formula, we could calculate our MA as, that is Vmax. Vmax is nothing but your 50 minus Vmin. Vmin is nothing but your 10 upon Vmax, that is your 50, plus Vmin is nothing but your 10. So it implies nothing but 40 upon 60, that again turns out to be 2 by 3, that will be equal to 0.67. So in both the cases we are getting the same answer. So it is up to you, and depending upon whatever data is given to you, you could easily evaluate the value of modulation index. So now in the next numerical problem, we need to find out the modulation index and percentage of modulation. Whereas the modulating signal is given to us 10 cos 2 pi FMT. This is your message signal. So we could say as message signal MT is given to us, that will be equal to 10 cos of 2 pi FCT, and carrier signal is also given to us, CT will be equal to 20 sine of 2 pi FCT. So I am closely observing these two values. Your AM or peak amplitude of the message signal is given to us, that is your 10, and your AC or peak amplitude of the carrier signal can be given as your 20. So via simple definition of MA, which is nothing but your AM upon AC, we are left with 10 upon 20, that will be equal to 0.5. And if we will going to calculate it in terms of percentage, we will simply say as 0.5 into 100, that will be equal to 50%. These are the answers. So hopefully you will get the insight about the modulation index and its physical significance, what its role in amplitude modulation systems. In case of any doubt, you can ask me in the comment section. I will try to solve it out as soon as possible. These are the references. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.